And live, Brad, here we are. I'm really happy to have you my guest for a chat in this topic that I am very ignorant. So I need your help to understand a little bit better. Where are you based now?
So I live in the Midwest in the United States. I live in Kansas City, which is exactly in the heart of America. It's north and south and east and west, or right in the middle. You ever been here before?
No, I never been there, actually. I mean, I've been in US, but I never been in Kansas City. And what's the situation now with the COVID and the election in the same time, and the black protest? I mean, well, it's not an easy situation, I imagine.
Yeah, it's tense. COVID, the COVID initially, of course, was really bad in like the East Coast and the major cities like, New York and places like that. Where I live in the Midwest in Kansas City, it's actually starting to flare up now. These are starting to be the problem areas. So we've been on lockdown like everywhere else, but it hadn't been as bad as the East Coast and places like New York, but it's starting to come up a little bit. The governor of Missouri, for example, just came down with COVID today. I can't believe we're still dealing with headlines like that. But yeah, so we're trying to get through it. And, politically, everything is just tense right now with the election. There's so many issues like for the first time ever, we're having a large portion of our voting through the mail. And we don't even know if our postal service can handle that. And it's very controversial about the security of the elections and everything. And then, the racial tensions that we're having are very sad and are not going away anytime soon. So this has been a really unique time, for some sad reasons in U.S. history. And it's going to be a wild ride, at least through the election. So it's going to be a very news-filled, month ahead.
Yeah, it's crazy. I see also here in UK, I mean, we having Brexit, of course, and then COVID. And 2 days ago, Boris Johnson said, all right, probably the prediction is 50,000 cases per day. In October, if we don't do anything, 200 deaths per day. This is the forecast, and so we don't go to lockdown, because in UK they don't say you go to lockdown. They say you should go to lockdown. It's a British way of dealing with things, and it's really confusing the situation at the moment. And they have this new rule of 6. That you cannot gather together more than 6 people. The restaurants will need to close at 10 o'clock. I mean, they are putting some rules, but the feeling is that we'll probably go in a second lockdown. And it's weird. It's a strange feeling, because I live in Brighton and everything is normal here. The hospitals are empty. Yeah, people with masks, but there is nothing really happening. So you're struggling a bit to understand the situation. Help us starting from there. So what's your picture of the COVID situation at the moment? How bad it is? How is improving? What's the situation in your opinion?
Yeah, well, it's different everywhere. I know in parts of Europe, countries did a great job with shutdown. And I know that in some parts of Europe, life is returning to normal. I do a lot of business in China, for example. And, in China, with some rare exceptions of like travelers coming in, there's literally 0 cases. And people are starting to have business conferences again. And, masks are no longer mandatory and things like that. So really, it's like a different answer depending on where you are in the world. In the United States, it's still pretty bad. It's not as bad, of course, and thankfully it's not as bad as it was in March, April, and May, when it was, at its scariest moment. But especially, as I was saying, in places like there's like new hotspots. So in some of the Midwestern states, like where I live, it's starting to really rise to a pretty alarming level. And so without a doubt, sadly, in the United States, we don't have a lid on it yet. So we need to do a better job of mask wearing and taking it seriously to really get it under control. And the bottom line, what we're going to talk about this a lot today. What's really going to be required to put this to bed so that we, life can truly return to normal and like we don't have to, hopefully worry about it one day, is we need successful vaccines. I have a saying, what we're doing now is what's called containment, staying home and wearing masks and everything. I have a saying I like to say that, containment can do the blocking, but it's only science that can do the tackling. It's really going to take a vaccine to fully tackle this problem, so that, people can go back to work. And, we have sporting events here, there's just like you have there, like, no audience in the crowd. You really need successful vaccines to have that type of normalcy again.
So tons of questions about vaccine, of course, and obviously also Novax and conspiracy theories. I mean, there is everything in this moment, in every country, by the way. I would start with that. It's interesting to me to see that there are very irrational decisions in different countries. I give you an example. Here in UK, during the August period, the government successfully did the Eat Out, Help Out program. So to incentivize people to go to the restaurant, they said, all right, if you go to the restaurant during August, it's half price. The government will pay 50%. So they served 64 million meals on 67 million people in UK. Really successful. But if you stop a second to think, you say, man, but does it make any sense? I mean, yes, it makes sense economically, and I'm happy for my friends that own a restaurant, but you gather people together, and maybe it's not so smart to push people to go outside, out and eat out. So it doesn't make any sense. But every day you see this totally irrational thing. And in the comment, I saw one interesting comment that said, I'll find it for you. Let me see. Massimo was saying, look like that the war managed COVID-19 as a national problem, but why you don't do a global team for the solution? So why don't we do like, okay, lock down everyone now for this 3 months, and that's it, everyone on the same page, but it's not.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And the reality is when such an emergency came up like this, countries really did view it as like every country for themselves. And they all did make different decisions, some better than others. And maybe the silver lining is that this, will be a learning experience for us for the next one, because there will be a next pandemic.
Right.
These things actually do happen more regularly than you'd think. And one thing I think from all of this, I travel a lot in Asia, for example, and, you would see people wearing masks and people who remembered like going through SARS and, very scary as previous pandemics. And one thing that I think really, one reason why I think it's been so bad, especially in the United States, and also I think to a certain degree in Europe, is in our lifetimes, this is really the first time we've experienced something this badly. And the analogy that I use is like a hurricane. Like if you live in like Florida and have never experienced a hurricane before, when the first one comes through, you don't know what to do. It's like a scary, first time experience, and like it's new for you. But when the second and third one comes around, to board up, to get out of town, to take it seriously. So in many ways, I think that the pandemic was kind of like that in the United States. We've never gone through this before. So when this first came through, there was total confusion. Like, are masks a good thing or are masks a bad thing? Like a lot of smart scientists had, differing opinions on that, and just things like that I don't think we really knew how to handle. Whereas in Asia, in China and places like Hong Kong and Singapore that have been through these before, like the moment they heard the news, everything shut down. Like everyone knew what to do. Like, and so maybe that helped, lessen the spread in those types of places that have been through this before. So, maybe if we go through something like this again in the future, it won't be as bad, because now in Europe and the United States, we've gone through it. And, next time you and I hear about like a potential pandemic coming through, we're probably not going to think twice. We're probably going to take it extra seriously next time, and, really watch our own behavior and everything. And going back to the commenter's question, there will be a lot of time after this for governments to really analyze how the world handled this. And obviously a lot of mistakes were made. And I think maybe things will be put in place to have, more sharing, and maybe to tackle the next one more from a global perspective than we did this first one.
Let's go into this vaccine development. I was really interested to have this chat with you, because you do a lot of investments in the biotech sector, and you have I think the right grip to understand at what stage all these vaccines are. Can you help us to understand the situation? Because every day a different news come out. I heard Trump saying, yeah, the vaccine is coming soon. And then Fauci said, no, it's not. So when is coming? Yeah. Who is working on these vaccines? What stages are? What countries? Every day there is a new country. They have the vaccine tomorrow. No, but then will not be available. It's really confusing. Help us to understand better.
Yeah. So first of all, one thing that we can all be proud of is that developing vaccines is actually a very difficult business. And in the past, it took years and years. So to give you an example, one of our most recent global outbreaks like this was the Ebola crisis in Africa. And when that came around, a bunch of companies and other researchers tried to develop a vaccine, and some successfully did. So the first company to get an Ebola vaccine approved in both Europe and the United States is Merck. Actually, outside of the United States, it's called MSD. That Ebola vaccine was just approved last year at this time, 5 years after the Ebola crisis really broke out. So our most recent example of going through a pandemic and developing a vaccine for one is that, and it took 5 years. In this case, we've been able to speed that up, and fingers crossed that we'll get a quicker success. And there's a couple things that have allowed companies to do that. Number one, as I'll describe in a moment, new technologies are just allowing companies to develop vaccines a lot faster. Like the science is better today than it was even just 5 years ago. And the second thing is, I think that companies and governments and investors have done a great job of really rallying to the cause and having a all hands on deck attitude of getting these things developed. So the first group of vaccines are in the final stages of testing. We may get some answers very soon about whether the first handful of vaccines work. So let's first talk about the stages of testing, because that's very important. Your viewers might be familiar with this concept that in drug and vaccine development, you typically have 3 phases of drug development. So for whenever you have something that's totally new, like a vaccine or a treatment, the first thing you do is what's called a phase 1 study. In a phase 1 study, you just give it to a handful of people, maybe a dozen or 2 dozen. And the goal of a phase 1 study is not to prove that it works, but to prove that it's safe to move on to later stages of study. So that's what companies initially did. After that, you do a mid-stage phase 2 study where you give it to more people, so maybe 100 people. And in phase 2, you're trying to determine 2 things. You're trying to determine more safety by giving it to more people, but you're also trying for the very first time to understand if you think that the vaccine might be working. And the way that companies do that is they measure the antibody response that the vaccine is creating. So if you're somebody who comes down with COVID and gets, hopefully gets over it one day, your immune system learns from that. You create what's called neutralizing antibodies. So when you come across COVID in the future, hopefully those antibodies will prevent you from getting COVID again. That's the whole idea behind, immune memory and the immune system. So how companies develop these vaccines is in the phase 2 testing, they give people the vaccine and they look at the amount of antibodies that they're creating, and they compare that to antibody levels of people who have naturally come down with COVID and gotten over it. And if the vaccine is producing antibodies that are equal or greater, then you have a pretty good guess that it might cause protection in the future. It might, just like natural immunity might protect you from coming down with COVID, then maybe that vaccine would. So a lot of companies did that. Now, the catch with that is it doesn't actually prove that it protects you from COVID. It's just kind of a middle step that gives you a strong hint that it might work. So the only way to truly prove that a vaccine works is to do a large phase 3 study. And that's what's happening right now. And how companies do that is they do a very large sample size. So typically they take 30,000 people. And typically what they'll do is they'll give half of those 30,000 people the vaccine, and they'll give half a placebo shot. And then they'll see how many they'll let them live their lives, and they'll see how many in each group come down with COVID.
Right.
And if less people in the vaccine group come down with COVID than the placebo group, then that's proof that the vaccine is working. So that's what is happening right now is there's a handful of companies that are running large phase 3 studies like that, where they're comparing people who've gotten the vaccine to people who've gotten a dummy shot and trying to prove whether that vaccine is actually protecting you from coming down with COVID. So we're hoping to get the very first answers from some of those phase 3 studies over the coming months. We may get them as soon as October. And so we may know for the very first time if those vaccines are working. Now there's going to be some controversies around it, because typically with a vaccine like that, you would want to follow the people in the study for like a year to make sure that safety is really true. And I really want to highlight safety. Safety is so important when you're developing a vaccine. And the reason is a vaccine you're giving to healthy people. This isn't like a treatment where you're trying to help people who are in the hospital with COVID. You're giving healthy people, and with COVID, we may literally vaccinate billions of people around the globe. So if a vaccine has some terrible side effect in 1 out of 100,000 people,
that's a disaster,
that could be a serious thing. So like, for example, in the United States, there's you asked about politics earlier, which inserts itself into everything. Well, there's a lot of politics around these vaccine trials because President Trump, for example, strongly wants there to be a vaccine approval before Election Day because, he thinks that that's going to help his reelection.
He will save the world,
Yeah, but there's, some scientists who might not be comfortable with that. Even if you get a strong efficacy signal that these vaccines are working, they would like to see more safety data, before Election Day, before you'll be able to make a call on that. So there's going to be controversies, but there will be news headlines either in October, for sure before the end of the year, but starting in late September, which we're in now, but October, November, and December, you're going to start to see headlines about phase 3 trials reading out, telling us if some of these vaccines actually work or not. So these are going to be earth-shattering type headlines. I mean, it's going to be big, so we'll have to watch for them.
And what are the countries, Brad, that are more advanced? Is US or China or Europe?
Yeah, so all of the above. I can tell you some of the major candidates. So one thing that's very exciting, like the very first vaccines that went into trials in the United States use a brand new technology that's totally new called messenger RNA. And the companies that are at the forefront of that is there's a US company called Moderna, and there's a German company called Biotech. And Biotech is partnered with Pfizer around the world. So if you hear Pfizer, the underlying technology behind that is actually this German company. And this messenger RNA technology is pretty cool. It's so powerful that when COVID was first happening in China in January, the Chinese authorities published on the internet the RNA, the genetic sequence of COVID. And this mRNA technology is so new and interesting that these companies were able to take that genetic sequence of the virus, and within 2 months, Moderna had a vaccine in clinical trials in the United States. They were the first one able to do that because of this powerful new technology. And again, that's something that normally in the past would have taken years. So in the United States, the lead vaccines are Pfizer and Moderna using these messenger RNA technologies. So they're the most advanced in phase 3 trials here. Another big one, you've probably heard a lot about the University of Oxford in the UK. Yeah. So they've partnered with AstraZeneca, the big pharmaceutical company, and they have a different technology. They're using what's called a viral vector vaccine. And it's actually pretty cool how it works. So viral vector vaccine, companies take a virus and they make it so that it's harmless. And they insert the genes for COVID into the virus. And that's the vaccine. So you get injected with this vaccine, that virus infects your cells and inserts the gene for what's called the COVID spike protein into your cell. Your cell starts making that. It's this protein. It's what's called an antigen. And then your immune system learns from that and hopefully creates, immune memory and an immune response once you come across COVID. So this University of Oxford did a great job of developing that very quickly. And they actually, even sooner than the United States, they started big late stage studies in Brazil, South Africa, and the UK. And we may get an answer from those any day now, within the coming weeks as well. That's also in a large phase 3 study in the United States, but the United States portion of that study only started recently, so we won't hear the results from that portion of the study until a few months later. So that's a big one as well. Mm-hmm.
But sorry, Brad, but the fact that they are in this phase 3, it doesn't mean that the vaccine will be effective. Maybe the results are, we did phase 3 and it didn't work. Possible.
That's right. Yeah, right. And that's actually one thing that scares me, because in the news lately, especially in the United States, I'm not sure how it is in Europe, but we're talking about it as when and not if.
Yes.
Like the first one we think we're going to find out the results from is the Pfizer vaccine. Like that's the one where the trial has enrolled the quickest. And because this election component of all of this is so politically charged, everyone's talking about this a lot. And it really, one thing that concerns me is everyone's talking about it like, is this going to succeed before the election, or is this going to succeed after the election? And nobody's considering the fact, as you just said, that this can outright fail. And biology is very difficult, and problems arise all the time. And also, by the way, safety issues can come up. And in fact, That just happened with this Oxford one and AstraZeneca. That trial was put on pause recently because one of the trial participants in the UK had essentially like an inflammation of the spinal cord. And wow. They had to stop the trial to try to understand, did the vaccine cause this, or is this something that the person already had and was, going to have happen to them regardless? That gets back to the point that safety is so important when you're talking about these things. Like literally, if one patient out of tens of thousands has something serious happen to them, it's worth stopping the trial to figure out like what went on there. And there was never really a conclusive answer in this case. The UK trial ended up restarting, but in the United States, that trial is actually still on pause. The US FDA is still trying to look at that and figure out what happened before they allow the trial to continue here. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's worth noting that bad things can happen. We all have our fingers crossed, and we believe that these all have a high chance of succeeding. And the reason we believe that is because we've seen the phase 2 antibody data. Like, we've compared the antibodies that the vaccines are creating to help, people who have recovered from COVID, their antibody levels. And we have a strong reason to believe that the antibody response from these vaccines will be strong enough to give people protection. But this is such a new thing, and a new disease that we're still learning about every single day. Until you run a phase 3 study, you don't know. And another thing that's really important is, vaccines. Unfortunately, some people view them very skeptically. Vaccines have truly changed the world and really, changed terrible diseases that, people were dealing with decades and hundreds of years ago. Like, we don't have to worry about today because of the power of vaccines. Like, vaccines are a great thing, but there's, some groups within society that are skeptical of them. And that's one reason why it's really important that this is done right, and why it's really, to me, alarming that, especially in the United States, politics is being interjected into this. And, some people are trying to maybe push for their approval, maybe sooner than they should, whereas other people want to delay it a lot more and everything. Like, it's important that we have scientific consensus on all of this and that there's not controversy, because, again, vaccines are our path to normalcy. You've probably heard this term, herd immunity. Sure. Vaccines are how we get to that. We need, a large percentage of the population to take these vaccines so that COVID can't spread anymore. And if there's skepticism about whether they're safe or whether they really work, then, some people may choose not to take them, and that's bad for our society as a whole. So it's important that we have confidence in all of this. And yeah, one other thing I should mention is, another important thing to know about vaccines is they're not going to be 100% effective. Some people think that's how vaccines work. Like, if you hear that this succeeds, then it means that if you get the vaccine, you're not going to get COVID. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. They're going to give like a certain level of protection. So in the United States, for example, the Food and Drug Administration here has said, they've already published a paper on this in advance. They've said, we'll consider approving a vaccine as long as it has 50% protection, so that you're 50% more likely to be protected from COVID than if you had no vaccine at all. So we'll have to see how strong they end up being, but it also is important to know that no vaccine is going to be a silver bullet.
That's an interesting point, because on one side you don't want the vaccine to be worse than COVID, because that would be a disaster. So you have to be sure that it's safe. And on the other side, there was a question here. Angelo, for instance, said, I know that there are 6 different coronavirus strains. I don't know if there are 6, but that's what Angelo said. Which one is used for vaccine? Because I think among skeptical people is the one important point is, all right, you get a vaccine for this variant, let's say. I don't know how you say in English. This kind of COVID, and then it changes and becomes
mutates.
Mutated, and so it becomes variant B, variant C, variant D. But then what do? You do another vaccine. So how do you deal with this changing that will happen? Maybe is already happening.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think the scientific consensus today, and it can always change because we're learning about this in real time, and we didn't know a lot in the beginning and we still don't, but currently today, that actually isn't seen as a big problem. They think that most vaccines will be able to provide protection against most variants of this.
Right.
And so it's not really a worry. How most vaccines are being developed today, and not all, one thing that's great, by the way, is that there's dozens and dozens of approaches to creating a vaccine. And there's a lot of ways that companies and researchers are trying to hit this. And so the scientific community is trying to be ready for all scenarios. The current kind of first rounds of vaccines, how they work is the virus has something called the spike protein. When you've seen pictures in the news of the virus, you've probably seen pictures of like a round ball with like little red things coming out of it. So those red things are what's called the spike protein. The spike protein is actually the thing that attaches to your cells and allows that virus to attach to you and to infect you and drop its genetic payload into you so that you start creating more of the virus. So all of the vaccines that are the leaders today are really zeroing in on using that spike protein as the basis for the vaccine. So again, like to use the AstraZeneca example, they've taken a virus and they've taken the genetic code for that spike protein. That virus infects you and drops the code for that spike protein into you, and then your cells start making that. And your immune system recognizes it that it's a foreign protein, and learns from that, so that when the virus comes in, your immune system starts to recognize those little red spike proteins, and it blocks those from attaching to you. So that's kind of how the first round works. And they don't think that to get to the listener's question, they don't think that the mutations are, as long as the vaccines do that and do that effectively against the spike protein like that, they don't think the mutation issue is big enough that it would really cause the vaccines to not work. But we don't know. That's one of the things about this that we'll find out over time. But right now, I don't think people really view that as a huge concern today.
Got it. Another point that I see when people talk about vaccines is, all right, on one side, there is a safety issue and adverse reactions and all the problems that can derive from a vaccine that is not working properly. So this is one problem. And on the other side, there is the business side. Some people say, well, vaccine is a business. That's why they want to push out billions of vaccines. Who is paying for these vaccines? I mean, who is investing in these vaccines? What is the business model? Is a business that is really interesting for investors? Yes or no? I mean, because you said it takes a long time, a lot of time. There are probably investments that are more interesting than a vaccine from an investor perspective. I don't know, but I would like your take from inside. Yeah.
Yeah, so vaccines have traditionally, from an investor standpoint, actually been a very difficult thing to invest in because the margins are very low compared to other types of medicines. And the science has always been difficult. It's developing vaccines. We've made it sound easy lately, but it's actually a very difficult business. So one thing I'm very proud of our industry, the pharmaceutical industry has like the worst reputation of any industry, and a lot of it is well earned. Especially in the United States, our drug prices are so high. It's truly crazy. But one thing I will say is, in my opinion, all companies have gotten into this for the right reason. Everybody understands that this is a once in a generation event, and it's important that we tackle it. And I don't think initially it's about money. So you said, who pays for this? While this is a pandemic, almost in all cases, governments are going to pay for this. And one thing that's important, one reason why vaccines take years and years to develop is because it's such a risky business. Companies traditionally wouldn't have invested in their manufacturing and their commercialization facilities until they knew for sure that their vaccine worked, because the failure rate in the past has been so high. And one thing that's been great is governments around the world, the United States, the European Union, and private organizations, endowments and things like that, have literally put up billions of dollars to help companies pre-fund building their factories and to start producing these vaccines today, not knowing if they're going to work or not. And some of them will end up failing, and those vaccines will have to be thrown away and will have lost billions of dollars. But a lot of governments and other organizations have put up money to really start building out the infrastructure today so that we are ready when the first successes do happen. And a lot of them have also already contracted with these vaccine makers for the initial doses once, one succeeds. So AstraZeneca with the Oxford vaccine, they've already got agreements with the European Union, with the United States, and with other parts of the world for X number of doses of that vaccine. They're already starting to manufacture them and get them ready, for that, day that we're all hoping happens, where we find out that it works and that it can be distributed throughout the world. And I think in most, if not all cases, the vaccines are essentially going to be free for people. That's definitely the case in the United States and Europe. The governments have already pre-funded, have already prepaid for the first batches. And for the average citizen out there, you may have to pay your doctor something to administer it, but the vaccine itself will essentially be free for you. And the prices are actually pretty good. The most expensive ones so far, the agreements we've seen, are those messenger RNA ones, because the technology is so advanced. Those are going to end up being about $40. But the AstraZeneca vaccine is less than $10. So the companies are not putting ridiculous prices on these and trying to gouge the governments or the public. Now, one thing to watch, one thing about these vaccines that we don't know that we'll find out over time is it may end up being the case that you need to get them regularly. The efficacy may wane over time, and you may need to get a booster shot once every 2 years or once every 3 years or something. And eventually, so what all the vaccine makers have eventually said is, during the pandemic phase of this, which is, who knows how they're defining that, but today, while this is a scary problem, they have what I think are pretty moderate prices that there's, are okay. But once this this pandemic phase ends, if this becomes like a regular thing that people need, just like, you know, a flu shot or something, eventually the prices will rise. But, you know, we'll deal with that problem when we come to it. The first thing is to get the pandemic in our rearview mirrors.
And apart from the vaccines, are there any other therapeutics or other approaches that are in this moment developed? Because obviously one interesting idea is that if I have my immune system really healthy, then probably I can deal better with any kind of problems. It's not only about this virus. Is it anything that is going in this direction, or anything that you're investing in, some biotech development that try to find different alternative methods?
Yeah, well, and you know, there's kind of two ways to look at this. There's vaccines, which of course are meant to prevent people from coming down with COVID. And then there's companies that are developing treatments that are meant to help people who are stricken with the disease. And the way to think about treatments is, like in the very beginning of this, like in March and April when COVID was raging, when an emergency happens like that, the first thing that you do is you throw at it what you already have. So you take existing drugs that are meant for other diseases that you think might work for this, and you kind of throw those at the problem. And a lot of companies did that, and there's been a couple successes. So the most famous one, there's a company called Gilead Sciences that has a drug called remdesivir that's like an antiviral, and that was the first treatment to succeed. So it showed that on average, they proved this in a real clinical trial, for people who had severe COVID. So these are people who are hospitalized, you know, and in really bad shape, that on average, remdesivir got people out of the hospital 4 days earlier than people who didn't get remdesivir. So that was the very first success. And then there was a study in the UK of a common steroid, like an anti-inflammatory, that succeeded as well. And there's still some trials of other, you know, current treatments that people have thrown at this that are happening right now, and we'll have to see how those go. But that's kind of the emergency phase. The second phase is a lot of companies are trying to tailor make, you know, treatments specifically for this. And I think the most exciting ones to watch there are what's called antibody treatments. So there's some companies, some of the largest, most famous ones. There's a big one called Regeneron. Eli Lilly in the United States is doing this. They're trying to make antibodies that block COVID from infecting you. And the cool thing about those is, depending on how you dose them, they could potentially be used as a treatment for people who have, you know, are in the hospital with serious cases of COVID. Or if you use a smaller dose, they might be used as a preventative thing, just like a vaccine. And those are in trials right now, and we'll find out answers from those before the end of the year. So that's the major thing that I would watch, is the antibody-based treatments to see if those succeed.
Got it. Tell me about the biotech sector, maybe a bigger picture about it. We just talk about COVID and vaccine, but biotech is eating the world, like,
yeah.
You know, software was eating the world, now it's biotech eating the world. What are the most interesting sectors where biotech, in your opinion, has great potential to develop interesting things?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, as a biotech investor myself, one thing that I think is interesting, and I think a really good thing, is, you know, COVID has opened people's eyes to how integral this section is to, you know, the normal functioning of society. And it's also opened people's eyes to some of the exciting new technologies that are in our sector. You know, I've always felt a little frustrated. I've always felt that biotech has kind of been a hidden secret, because, you know, like the tech sector, you can see a Tesla driving down the street. You know, you use social media, you use software, you see the advances in tech every single day. because biotech is medicine, and frankly, in a lot of cases, you only need it when something bad has happened. Most people don't see it in their daily lives, and there's some things in biotech and medicine right now that are truly like revolutionary. So like one that I focus on a lot is cancer. There's a lot of new things in cancer care that I think are really, for the first time, making a true huge impact on cancer. The one I'm most excited about is what's called immunotherapy. So companies are harnessing a person's own immune system to treat cancer. It's really amazing. So there's a handful of immunotherapy drugs that are already on the market. So like, for example, people have wondered for like 100 years, like, well, why doesn't the immune system naturally recognize cancer as something that's foreign, like a virus or a bacteria, and attack it? And one reason the immune system doesn't do that is cancer has overexpresses a protein on the outside of cancer cells. It's called PD-L1. That's like a stop sign. So when the immune system's going through the body and it comes up to the cancer cell, it sees that stop sign and it kind of turns away. Well, once scientists learned about that stop sign, they created a drug that inhibits it and essentially lowers that stop sign. They're called PD-1 inhibitors. The most famous one in the world is a big one called Keytruda, that people might be familiar with that name. And so these drugs like lower that stop sign on the cancer cell and allow the immune system to naturally attack the cancer as like a foreign thing, as you would think it would. And that's revolutionized certain types of cancers. The first thing that worked in is melanoma, like skin cancer. And then it's also made a huge difference in lung cancer, and bladder cancer, and kidney cancer, and a lot of others. So it's really like a new standard of care. So just as we knew like chemotherapy over the past couple of decades is like, the primary way of treating cancer, in many ways, the primary way of treating cancer now is using immunotherapies. Another thing within cancer, another promising approach is what we call precision medicine. Genomics. One thing that researchers have learned is that every single person's cancer has a unique genetic profile. And we're starting to sequence, the tumors and trying to perfectly match it up to a drug that would, be most likely to work for that person's the genetic profile of that cancer. So there's a lot of very hyper-targeted cancer medicines like that. So in cancer, I could literally talk for hours and hours about cancer. There's a handful, I think, of really game-changing technologies. You and I actually have a common friend, who's working in the cancer area with a great company in Italy. And that's the number one space that I'd watch in terms of like true advances happening that are really making a big impact for patients. Another technology that I would put on your radar is something called gene therapy and gene editing. So for the last, the previous few decades, we've been reading the genome. So, your genome is like the instruction manual that makes you who you are. And it took it took a long time to be able to read that and to analyze it and to be able to understand it. And one thing that we've learned from that is there's a lot of terrible diseases that happen because like if your genome is like a book, with like 1,000 pages, there are some terrible diseases that are caused by like one word on one page being wrong. Like that's just something that small can, cause very big problems. And where we're at today is we're using gene editing tools to try to fix that word, to try to rewrite it so that it's the right word so that you don't have that disease anymore. And we're in the very early stages of that, but there are some gene therapy and there will be some gene editing medicines on the market soon. So the first gene therapy was approved in the United States. It literally helps people with a type of blindness see. I mean, that's how amazing these types of new technologies are. These people have a genetic defect, essentially a word in their book that's wrong that causes a blindness in them. And a company was able to create a therapy to drop the right word back into their book.
Incredible.
To help them see again. So it's just things like that I really think, I love that you said, it used to be that software is eating the world and now it's biotech. I really believe that. I really believe that the last couple of decades were kind of tech's decades. And I believe that the upcoming, 10 or 20 years, like really the important advances in society are going to come from biology. So as a biotech investor, I've never been more excited. I think ours is going to be a sector of focus for a long time to come. And
you launched, Brad, by the way, Pierluigi Paracchi, founder of Genenta. Hi to Pierluigi, and thanks for the connection. Yes. They're going very, very, very strong. You also launched one fund, two funds?
Two, yes. Yeah. So I create what's called ETFs in the United States. So ETFs are like, if you're familiar with like a mutual fund, but they trade on the stock exchange.
Right.
And so I create biotech ETFs. The goal of my company is to make it easier for more people to invest in biotech. And the way to do that is to create, diversified baskets of companies that are, diversified and hopefully safer and easy. It makes it easier for people to invest in biotech. So I have one that actually focuses on that cancer immunotherapy area that I mentioned. And I have another one that focuses on China biotech. That's another topic that we could talk for hours about. China is catalyzing a true innovative biotech sector there for the first time. Before today, China's pharmaceutical sector was mostly focused on generic drugs. And they're trying to create a biotech sector just like we have in Europe and the United States, because that's the future. And so there's a big biotech sector cropping up in China today. So one of my ETFs focuses on China biotech to help people invest in that as well.
Incredible. And what do you think is the situation in China now?
Well, I think it's super exciting because think of the tech sector. The way I think of it as an investor is, a couple decades ago, you had entrepreneurs like Jack Ma who saw what was happening in Silicon Valley in the United States and wanted to replicate that in China. And they founded companies that, today are household names like Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu. And in many ways, in certain technologies, Chinese tech companies are at the forefront today. And that all started a couple decades ago, essentially from scratch. And now these are, you always think of China as like copycats and things like that. Well, in tech, they're now at the forefront of many technologies. And we're in the very early stages of that happening in biotech. You have a lot of biotech entrepreneurs who have seen how the biotech sectors in the US and Europe work, and are trying to incubate that back home in China. And there's big support for it there. The government has revamped their version of the FDA and really brought it up to global standards. And the stock exchanges are starting to embrace biotech companies there. And you have like kind of this perfect storm of elements that are all coming together to catalyze an innovative biotech sector in China for the very first time. And I think it's going to be big. I think it's one of the most important things that's happening in our biotech sector today, and that will affect us over the next 5 or 10 years.
Very, very, very interesting. Brad, thank you so much. It was really interesting and to see all of this biotech revolution. And let's hope that with this COVID will, in 12 months, if we meet again in 12 months, will be a different situation and better for everyone. Excellent, Brad. Let's keep in touch. And thanks again for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Good luck.